Hello, welcome. TheoryForge episode 44. Sorry we couldn't make it last week. I was out of town. I don't know where everybody else was, but
Holiday time.
yeah.
Yeah.
It was the 3rd it was the 3rd of July. We were busy. Yep, couldn't make it last week, but we've got a pretty good topic that I've been wanting to talk about for quite a while. For today, which is how in an MMORPG we want to experience the story of the world. And I'm gonna broadly separate it into or first I want to talk about something that we all know very well, which is that the game is designed to make every individual player feel like the hero of the world. The individual story method. That was done well in World of Warcraft. It was done well in Rift. It was done pretty well in Star Wars The Old Republic. It's fantastic in Final Fantasy XIV. But in an MMORPG, I'm saying that it has... This is something that we've seen be accomplished very well, I believe. But how do we feel about that as being how we define the genre right now? Like, when we talk about popular, successful MMORPGs, they follow this pattern and this formula more often than not.
I think what they've done really is taken off of the success of a lot of great single-player RPGs, kind of that hero's journey, and a lot of MMORPGs have really just pushed that into a multiplayer setting, and they add a lot of mechanics to try and spread that story around and make it make sense in the context of a lot of people, but usually there aren't typically any functional mechanics in the game that cause the story to be meaningful to a group of people. It's usually just meaningful to you as an individual. So I think this is a topic I wanted to discuss for a long time too, because it has a lot of potential. I think it's been largely untapped for a long time in this genre.
Yeah, and what you said there, actually, it's one of the pluses and the minuses is definitely the fact that we look at things like Baldur's Gate, for example, and, well, let's make an MMO, or Neverwinter Nights 1 and 2. And it's like, okay, well, let's make an MMO with that level of detail, and you're always playing the hero's quest and everything. Unfortunately, what that means is that the online interactions are always still a very static thing. It's not, dynamic. The world's always the same, no matter, when you end up playing it, plus or minus any patches or updates that come later. So really, it's not very different than playing an offline game, except for the fact that you have other people involved. And yeah, there's PvP, and it's got its place, but I feel like PvP is kind of probably going to be going by the wayside more and more as Dota-style MOBAs and other esports formats continue to pick up and gain popularity.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, like, there are these other things, and it's always stuck out to me that traditionally, or typically in all the popular MMOs today, any other group-based aspects to the game are usually outside of the narrative, or they're stuck within a static place of the narrative. The narrative doesn't progress at all within that realm of social gameplay. So,
or you need help from other people in a co-op mission to continue your own story. They like the dungeon gate. Like, you can't move on in your own story unless you have to find 4 other people to do this dungeon.
and if that's the extent of it, then they might as well just be NPCs. Like, there's no reason why you have to have other peoples other than this, forced social interaction. And I'm not saying that forced social interactions are a bad thing. I'm just saying it's not good if that's like the only way people really have to interact, is if you need to get a group together that's not going to get slaughtered in the first 5 pulls. So it's definitely a kind of one of the things that in storytelling I feel needs to be addressed in kind of a weird way, and that's basically that we need not only the a progression of events that actually go on point A to point B, and you can't necessarily go back to all those events at that time in that place. Now there could be historical crystals or whatever you can find that let you replay kind of a simulacrum of that event and learn and understand what it meant to be in that battle, or otherwise there's a journal, there's an encyclopedia, there's some recorded news, so that way on such and such day this person with this crew of people took down this specific mythical beast or whatever, and the peasants rejoiced, or the kings of the land betrayed them thereafter, or whatever, and at least having things depending on other things happening in the world and things being based on other things. That's kind of one of the things that games like what we were hoping for EverQuest Next, what we're hoping for with Revival, and even some other games. I don't know if they're going to do story with No Man's Sky, but I would imagine if they do, it's based on a lot of what the players are doing in the universe and how it adapts and develops to player interaction.
Well, what are some cool things that we've seen done with this single player and or co-op model? Like, one thing that stands out to me, when World of Warcraft implemented their phasing system, so that the same part of the world, for people who had progressed their own story different lengths, were experiencing a different thing going on. And I think what the way that they've done that and the way that works is impressive. What do you guys think about stuff like that?
So one of the things that I hear us talking about, or that we haven't actually quite mentioned, we've been dancing around, is having an impact on the world, and that's what Cataclysm brought to it. Mm-hmm. Is that we were starting to actually not have a completely static world, but the things that we were doing individually began to make changes in the world, and that kind of helped make it seem like the story was progressing. I think one of the things that you mentioned, Sog, that's kind of problematic even in that sense, though, is that, for instance, one of the things that we might spend our time doing, especially in WoW, is gaining factions. So there'd be two factions of centaurs, and you'd make a choice which one you're going to gain faction with. One would become your friend, the other one would become your enemy, and then what happens after that, okay? I mean, one hates you and the other maybe gives you a better price on goods, and so what?
You get the blue goat or the gold goat, depending on which mount you really wanted from the vendor.
Which is not enough of a relationship impact, and I think also, like you said, is that's an individual thing. So it's not like a guild could decide we're going to help out the Blue Centaurs and they're going to recognize us as a guild.
No, and it forces you to make decisions as a group of what you want to be. So, like, if you want to play with somebody in that area, you have to have done the same faction reputation grinding and planned it, but done it on your own. Even if other people were with you doing the grinding, you're still really doing it on your own.
Yeah, but there's no real repercussions from that, and that's what we really have to move towards, and that's what both EQ Next and Revival have been talking about, is having NPCs that have objectives that can change and respond to what we're doing both as individuals. And I think we need to start talking about that with the devs, is, well, I'm not talking to the EverQuest Next devs anymore, but the Revival devs, about how that will impact us as a group. That can be an interesting thing.
Getting to the group things and going back to what Zog was saying as far as the phasing in World of Warcraft, I thought that did an excellent job of improving the immersion of the story, and that you're actually, progressing in the world felt more dynamic. However, it actually was counterintuitive to group play, because if you're not in the same exact spot as somebody else, you're going to have to wait for them to catch up in phase or something. So it's really not ideal for an MMO, or that's not correct. It's not ideal for a social game, a social multiplayer game that's focused on meaningful interactions between players, because if you can't even see each other and do stuff with each other, So I think that's why, the things you guys have talked about, Revival, EverQuest Next, what they're trying to do in creating this dynamic world, they're trying to actually create the dynamic world and the changes happening without actually excluding players from each other's experience, which I think is key for an MMO. I mean, that's what separates it from a single-player RPG. So, I mean, this is the direction that I think any good MMORPG needs to move towards, is better AI or better world dynamics where the staticness is changing, but at the same time you're not excluding everyone else from each other's environment just to facilitate that change.
Now, I'm going to throw something out there. There is a model that exists that I think is going to start getting more and more popular. It's what we see in Dostal, it's what we see in Crowfall, and essentially it's what we see in Trove. Basically, a world only exists for a finite amount of time, and when it's done, another world is generated. And I like the idea of that as a progression model. I don't know, it would only work with, certain stories and certain types of games, but I personally like that, because it means basically as you're progressing, as you're doing different things, as things are, going on, new worlds that are generated will reflect the things that are going on. So if you and your buddies are cutting down one specific type of tree, then more worlds, going forward will have less of those trees, unless you go and have a big replanting campaign of some sort. And, that sort of stuff. Mining out materials till they're basically gone, and then something else kind of, reappears, or, there's a giant earthquake type event, and then worlds going forward have, a new material that wasn't available before. Kind of like the Star Wars Galaxies material cycling.
How is this pertaining to story?
Well, I was actually about to get to that. Is that then any story related elements, any persisting elements, like once again bringing Trove into example, a town that will exist in some spot, world after world after world, and how you interact with that town or all the other features around it. As a new world is generated, they'll reappear there. They totally understand what's going on. They just, it's not like, oh, we're in this magical world again or anything. No, they totally understand the mechanics of the world. It's just they can't influence change the same way that players can. So players are basically the ones driving the storyline of this town, and the interactions going on in the world and that sort of stuff.
So I don't understand.
Yeah, I don't understand
those two. So
never mind.
Wait, no, I want to get back to it, because it's an interesting concept. The one that I do understand is Crowfall, and I don't like that, because what I want is in terms of the world's changing, I want a persistent world, not a world that's going to be destroyed and I have to move to a new one, and then that one's going to be destroyed and I can't do anything to save it from destruction. I want a persistent world, and where all of the NPCs involved, all of the characters involved are going to remember my accomplishments and the accomplishments of my friends.
So you're saying that the world gets destroyed and people have to move on, and depending on what they've done in the world while it existed before they had to move to a whole new generated world, the world is generated differently? So, like, they're having to leave one environment and go to another?
Well, Crowfall, the thing with Crowfall is that really it's doing that, the worlds are changing, but you do have the persistent Outer Kingdom, so it's really a matter of where you want to spend your time. From what I've heard by the developers, I
meant from what Neuro's talking about from the story perspective, with Trove and... I don't understand that.
I guess it would be the idea that the like the town can't get any bigger. If they need more resources, they can't get them without the help of the players, or events that between the different towns would be facilitated by the players. They establish diplomatic relations. That's great. The road between those towns isn't going to exist until A, the resources have been committed to it, and then B, the next world is generated. Then no matter where town A and town B are, they'll always have a road connecting.
I guess I don't understand next.
I see what you're saying.
What's the next world part? How do you end up in the next world, and what does that mean for?
Well, I guess
consistency of your story.
I guess going with the Trove model, once all the dungeons have been completed in the world, and it's almost the same way as Realm of the Mad God. Basically, the world kind of collapses, and you have to find another world. But anything that you built on your own little claim, and you can move that claim to any little claim spots, you can just pop it up anywhere. So the idea would be kind of the same idea as Trove. Once everything's completed, instead of respawning monsters and bosses and stuff, you just make a new world with new bosses, new monsters, new loot, new challenges and such. And then you plop down in some of the potentially instance-ready areas the towns and stuff that existed in the previous round.
It seems like the easy way out of taking the time to figure out how you're going to make systems work to have a dynamic changing world all the time. Because really that is like a stopgap way of saying, hey, the game's going to work and be balanced all the time. When things run out, we have a story reason to reset.
But who are you in Trove? That's what because we're talking about story and ways of having stories work and ways of interacting with the game to get story. Who are you in Trove that you and your house move from world to world? I'm trying to understand it from a story perspective. I understand the gameplay perspective now, but then as part of the story.
I was just using that as like part of an example or part of a way to explain the example.
I think too, though, but like taking that example for story purposes, basically, like if you're going to say, hey, this faction, I think who does it say? Cody said in chat, main advantage of a new world spawn is you can create a world with no restrictions. There are two factions, one can win. So from a storytelling purpose, if your world resets, you can allow players to achieve things in their own personal story or group story that wouldn't normally be possible in a more static world, or would only be possible in a really dynamic world that has a lot of ways that it can balance itself back out and not let, what is the example they use in Crowfall? Risk, Uncle Bob at Risk, just dominating and, it just doesn't get fun at that point.
Purposely making the game not fun for everyone else. But, so that's a great idea but the trade-off is that the experience becomes episodic in nature.
It does, and it only works for games that work with that model. Now, a persisting world, you could kind of do similar sorts of things. You just have to be ready for world-transforming events. I think of Terraria, for example. While you can do all of that with one person, maybe it'd have to be a different way to do it with multiple people. The idea is that after you get to a certain point, now, spoiler alert if anybody hasn't played Terraria yet, you beat a certain boss, you have access to an area that you couldn't access before with items and things you couldn't normally use or access. If you beat a different boss, meteorites start to appear, and that's a new material. That's part of the progression in getting higher and higher and more powerful. You beat one of the bosses, and this giant V-shaped swath is cut through the entire world. Half of it is super corruption, which there was already corruption in the world, and the other half of it is this weird ultra divine that'll still, melt your face. And those add new materials, new challenges. When that happens, they also reseed and add new materials to the world, 3 more tiers of material that didn't exist. So that's a giant world-changing event, and when that happens, there's no going back. You are in hard mode now.
So the storytelling mechanism that you're talking about is you trigger catastrophic events to your surroundings and everything changes and you go through a new...
Yeah, just using that as an example. Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's definitely, and there can be a lot more to it than that. It's not necessarily beat a specific boss, but find an ancient ruins, decipher a mystery that like players actually have to use real deal cryptography and stuff to find out, and it takes like 3 months of searching for clues and putting together what you already knew, and then finally and the best part is if you do it right, you can set it up that every server has a different thing that they're trying to put in for the password or whatever to activate those ruins. So then it becomes really a group event. Now, once again, the idea that one person could potentially do this is a thing, but something that's that level of complexity and something that would literally take 10 years for somebody to actually navigate around and find all of those items and all those clues, that scale is something that really would require a large group. And then there would potentially be competition. A lot of, we want to do it first groups. So then there would be, all the betrayal and all of the, teamwork and stuff that would be related to that, to see who actually is the ones to do it first and who all is there.
But the story is then a predetermined linear path that one or many people are working to expose through gameplay.
Could be. I mean, it could be something that it's semi-predetermined. There's maybe 8 of these runes, and one of them gets activated. The other 7, something happens to, and they can't be activated, or the order they're activated causes different events, different challenges, different circumstances, different endgame conditions.
I think, what Sog is saying, like how that is an example of what a linear story could be. I think that kind of highlights the idea that, I don't know, I was just talking with a friend this week I was basically trying to describe Revival to him, and he's not an MMO player, he's just a player that absolutely loves RPG games, single player, plays a lot of console games. So I was trying to explain him the concept, and I kind of ran into this realization that, there's really 2 general types of storytelling or story settings for players. You have one that is a designed linear story. Actually, there's a couple. There's a designed linear story, there's a choose your own adventure story, or there's a create your own story when you're in a setting that has, lore and backstory. And I feel like those 3 types are like, on a spectrum. You've got the developer created, hey, you don't have any say in the story, this is the story, you go through it. Or you have the Mass Effect thing, choose your own adventure, you go through it, and it can be different every time. Or on the other end of the spectrum, the developers create the back lore, they establish the bigger, larger setting, and they let the players write the story within it. And those are I kind of think those are the 3 main ways you can go when you're designing a game. Obviously, there can be a blend of some of the types, there are games out there that I'm sure are in between, but it seems like those are the main vehicle, or the main methods of storytelling that a developer can choose out of the gate. Like, how do we want to make our game? How do we want to tell the story? Do we want to let the players tell a story with each other? Because I feel like that's kind of how EverQuest was before any expansions came. It was this lore backsetting, and you created a character, and you just explored and made your own stories. And then as the game persisted and expansions added on, they ended up creating a linear story out of it. But it originally almost was like a sandbox, but then it developed into a linear path. So it was kind of interesting the way that game evolved and the way that model kind of passed on, and now every MMO kind of takes that as the de facto method of storytelling.
So when I was...
Well, I just want to jump in. I always said that EverQuest didn't have a story, so...
Originally, it didn't. It was a static world with recurring events that people went and played in.
Yeah.
And I mean, there was lore, there was stuff to experience, there was stuff going on, but there wasn't an ongoing story. And when I was initially thinking up this topic was kind of the dividing into the idea of when in an MMORPG that has an ongoing story and is supposed to change, and there is a you are like reading the book of what's happening, going on in this world, that thinking about the different ways of communicating what that is to a player. And the one way that I started talking about at the beginning is you have a predetermined story that players just basically work through as a single-player game. with or without help. But in this other, I have two other potential alternatives that I was thinking of. One being hands-on storytelling where actual events are occurring that are guided by GMs. That it's Revival is planning on doing it on their gold servers. Some mods do stuff like that. But more, I want to talk about this idea of what if the story of a game were just how the world is changing, so that we talk about going in and just doing stuff. Imagine if we're playing EverQuest, the original EverQuest, where there was no story, but X number of people are in Freeport doing the same quest over time and time again, and then all of a sudden that triggers a change to the entire environment. So the role that people are playing within the world changes in response to how they have changed the world. But it doesn't have to be all coded in. It doesn't have to be this like super masterpiece of generated content. That you could have people looking at the data of what's going on and writing the story, but instead of it being, I'm writing an expansion to the game and people are going to go through this next set of quest lines and do this next set of dungeons, the story is, well, because all of these things happen, then we start feeding little bits of information. Then all of a sudden, you find notes and things. Then all of a sudden you're led towards something else. Some little one new quest opens up in the town. By quest, I mean, simple things like, hey, the cobbler always needs leather, so you can take leather to him. Not a quest, but you can help people in town and get a kickback. Of some
okay.
sort.
Well, here's one of the things that you mentioned, the big D, data, and that's actually one of the biggest things that's really expanded with better systems and servers and internet capabilities. The ability to have more complex AI running at any given time is much further than it ever was. In the past, you could only really have static NPCs, because if you had all those NPCs running around in the world, you wouldn't have enough room to process all the players and all of their actions in the world. So it wouldn't be very fun. It wouldn't be much of an MMO if there's only 50 people that can play. But it's the idea that we can now actually get something to, get the entire micro to macro scale. And what that leads to is we can actually have a world that's completely cause and effect based, where you could actually remove players from the world. The world can run on its own. In fact, even generating its own villains and its own heroes and their own interactions over time, having the seeds of events that differentially kind of grow and develop based on the events that go on in the world. That
you
are
just
all driven by
procedural generation.
That are all
That's
driven
like
by
thing.
cause and effect of what the NPCs need. If they all need wood because their houses keep getting nasty or whatever, and they don't do anything about it, they're going to cut down all the forest. Then they're going to need to either go further to get the lumber, which is going to expose them to more danger, extend their supply lines, require them to potentially trade over time. If wood was something they were trading in the past, no more, because it's become a limited resource. So this is that kind of cause and effect sort of thing, that as you lose access to things, they would have to compensate, and that's where players would be able to add a lot more dynamic influence. It's like, oh, you guys really need a lot of wood and work with wood, but you deforested the entire area like a bunch of dummies. Well, we can set up a supply line and give you a better price than anyone else, but we're going to need some certain permissions in order to actually make this happen. So, that's the sort of thing that I'd really like to see, is, a cause and effect based world where every individual has their own needs and their own things that they, consume.
Right. I mean, that's what we're looking for with EQ Next and with Revival. That's what they're promising in any case. But yeah, I think Zog's concept of you know, even if they were doing little things like kill Fippy Darkpaw enough times and he disappears and his parents or relatives get pissed off and start some kind of retaliation.
You don't have to plan it from a writing perspective ahead of time.
Right.
Because you have the information to know what has happened, and you can present something as a consequence of that, even though from a writing perspective it hasn't been planned. So,
although I would like some things to be planned, like
I agree.
From WoW, you know, we'll have these vendors who are sending us out to collect cotton or whatever, cloth, and we collect all this cloth and we take it to them and they never do anything with it. And it would be nice to, after weeks or months, cease, I don't know,
not since the initial war efforts in vanilla was there anything like that. But that was kind of the idea, that they used it as an item sink in the economy in a way to pass time, but you had to open the gates of like Encourage or however I don't even know how
also crossover competition.
Yeah.
But just something change that you're doing stuff and eventually we see a change is, you know, great.
So the examples Neuro was giving and Sog talking about, you know, allowing the players to make the story for themselves based on the cause and effect of the world. Like, all the things you guys are talking about kind of tie hand in hand, but it kind of like lit up, it's like an epiphany to me of something. When it comes to writing and story, basically, this is why I love Revival, because what it's doing is because the game is not going to be just necessarily about combat. Once you start allowing players to have prominent roles, influence, control over government, control over things that would actually affect and determine the course of action for NPCs, now they're writing stories. You know, like, I think player agency is tied so much to story direction, like, not just in the sense of, oh, choose my own adventure, but when you start giving players the ability to gain a lot of power and influence in a world, become a leader, a monarch, become you know, a huge general or something, once you give them that ability, they get to direct a story that all the other players may participate in or have to contend with. And that's a thing that happens, you know, and it kind of it moves away for the developers. They no longer have to take that burden of, okay, I've got to come up with a story. If you provide the systems and you equip people with the way to drive their own stories, as long as you have some checks and balances to ensure that, you know, people can't totally like ruin everything, which is why, you know, this is what I said, this is why I love Revival. If you are planning to have storytelling GMs in there, you know, to kind of bump, nudge, ensure things are, you know, remaining fun for the majority, you're essentially allowing the players to do all the work for you. You know, they're just creating a simulated world experience with a bunch of systems, and they're going to equip players and give them the tools to write the stories, which, you know, going back to the start of the show, what we were all enthralled about with Landmark, you know, separate from EverQuest Next, is the concept of creating your own story, create your own MMORPG. That's the thing so many people want, is this dungeon mastering tool, and it's because it's this next, I think that's the next gen thing, you know, creating a game world or a simulated environment where people are the story, you know. Then you don't have to feed somebody a hero's journey. They can make their own hero's journey. Maybe they don't want a hero's journey. They can take on some other smaller role. It really solves a lot of issues without, you know, I'm sure it comes with its own, you know, challenges, of course, but we're going to see games like Revival and EverQuest Next attempt to tackle this new thing and see what problems and issues they have to deal with. And I think, you know, I kind of favor Revival a lot because as a writer, seeing the way that they're designing the world, you know, because working on my own stories and books, you know, I've done a ton of world building, and building the world is like almost the biggest challenge. Once you built the world, writing the story is easy. You know, you create the characters, and if you create a good character, you're not even writing the story. The characters are writing the story for you. They're acting in accordance with what they would do based on the plot, you know, based on the events of the world, and it's a chain reaction. And I think that's what we need to see from a really good, for a really good MMORPG to happen, because to have a really good story that is also an entire social experience, the only way you can really accomplish that is in a simulated world, you know, and that's kind of where things have to go, I think.
I like the idea of experiencing a story that is, you know, or consuming a story. I like the idea of professional writers guiding a story. I just want, what I want is to experience it differently. I want the story to not be a predetermined path that I follow as a single-player game in a multiplayer world. I want the story to be how the world is changing. And I don't want it to be like, for my own experience, if I log into World of Warcraft and I level up to 80 or what at least at that point, I'm experiencing exactly the same path that I did because I leveled a character post Cataclysm. So I would be going through the same exact story. But I like the idea of the story being about, the story is how the world changes. And yes, create systems that allow the players to have their own interactions and different types of leadership and different things going on and different ways that players are interacting within that environment. But I still want this moving world. I want it to actually be moving in a direction and be steered somewhat by professional writers. Like, throw a bunch of people and their computers in front of an open world and tell them to go all have fun. Yeah. Maybe
you're saying that what you want is a multiplayer, online, evolving world.
Yeah, well,
and evolving is the big key. And to me, a big part of that, though, is this concept that we're having with the NPCs who have objectives, they have drives, they're going to react to what we do, but also what we do is going to impact how their lives progress. If we don't pay the vendors a lot of money, they're going to run out of stuff, and you know, their clothes and stalls might start deteriorating. And on the opposite end, if we're just funneling in money to them, then we see that they're prospering and their
gaining
clothes get richer
and
yeah, all that stuff. That's the kind of stuff that we want to see. Again, I think the thing that I need to start promoting more from now on is the group dynamic, because we are so used to it just being individuals, and it would be nice if groups get recognized for their accomplishments as a group as well. But yeah, those are the things that we have to see. We have to see not just us having an impact on all the characters in the world.
Yeah. That what you have done as a player and how you have acted in the world, and by choosing to sell your wares to one NPC, if that's even a mechanic in the game, that by making that choice, you are being a part of a change. And then to find neat and interesting ways of communicating back to a player of how they were involved. That, like, you get a letter in the mail from this vendor that you've been supporting, and it's like, due in part to your efforts, and thank you for being a regular customer, hey, we've been able to upgrade the shop. And this kind of thing, that the story really is changing, and the world is changing for new people jumping in without being necessarily harder or beyond them, but different. That instead of going to Neuro to buy a weapon, you're going to Diggs to buy a weapon, because the way that people have worked, and Diggs has gotten some practice, and maybe through some way he was introduced to some new techniques, and now he's the better person to go to, but you better be able to afford Diggs, Well,
and that's one of the great things again about Revival, is that the NPCs will come to you as you gain greater renown. They'll start coming to your shop if you have a shop. So it's great that players will come to you too, but it's phenomenal that NPCs will look for you and come to you because you're good at what you do.
I think that you guys are all talking about, really an engaging sandbox, that can change at small levels. You can affect NPCs at small levels that will then push the world. But then also having, I think what Saga's talking about, some bigger overarching plot that's adding even more meaning, because, if you helped, X NPC influence something, when you do something like a rallying call, or when you do something like a GM event that triggers something, that adds a lot more meaning to all the small things, because even if you were, little Joe Schmo, working in town, you never saw the world, but this huge cataclysmic event happens, even though maybe you didn't play the lead role in that, you can be like, oh yeah, I was there when that happened, I was running this, and everybody can feel like they're impactful, even if they're not the hero of the story, So you're not forced into this awkward situation of trying to explain out how everybody has the same thing, but,
I was completely sold on Paul talking about how they're writing for VNext, and that this is really like he got into my head with this, thinking about how in an MMO environment that you can continue writing the story as it goes, and not be working 2 years ahead of time with this pre-planned expansion and just hope that people don't catch up to the content, but having a planned schedule for progressing the story and building in a system that isn't going to kill your game every time you make a little bit of a change. That in the way that it doesn't need to be cataclysm. It doesn't have to be this huge event, but this ongoing story writing that takes into account not only the automated things that are changing based on how NPCs work and how players interact with them, but looking at the data of what people are doing as part of the story writing exercise to help continue progressing that, and building in diverging and converging paths for separation, but not to make it a huge task. Once a month or every 3 weeks or so, something is happening that is moving towards something, and then rarely, and you may not even know when it's going to happen, that climactic event will come and create a larger change, which it feeds right into the story, and that's when they can build in their system upgrade expansions and things like that to occur as the story of the world changing reaches a climactic event, instead of, well, we've given everybody 8.5 months to kill the Lich King. If they haven't done it now, they can go back, and that kind of feeling that, no, the world got there. The Lich King came, or whatever, but hopefully it wouldn't be just one boss that everybody experiences, that, there's a major invasion in this world, and hopefully you picked the right side, because if you picked the wrong side, you might end up struggling after this. But my point is, shorter pieces of added story and not quest storyline writing.
Well, I think it's important to note too that, probably every single MMORPG has writers that are tasked with, hey, what all has happened in the story, how can you chain events, take seeds from the past, and create this compelling story that makes sense with what players are experiencing in the world. The problem is, it all boils back down to is the systems that writers are limited by, because the in-game systems are going to determine what they're able to do, and what you're talking about, what Paul was getting you excited about this, the way that he's doing the story. One of the major things that makes VNext different than so many other games is the fact that they're planning to write the story as they go and actually take player feedback, watch the way players actually played the game to determine new things they want to do, which, I don't think I'm sure that big MMOs probably do that to some extent but just in the fact that they look at the way players are playing the game, see what things people are asking for, and then they create story reasons for including new mechanics or something like that.
I think they do it all the time for mechanics. I think that's how game mechanics changes come in. But I really feel like with the story, they're writing their story, and I'm happy to experience it. And a lot of them are very good, but it's not the world story. They're writing your character's story. That is the path. That is what your character is capable of. That's the distinguishing point.
The interactive part, the ability to kind of interact in the story they're writing, rather than just necessarily consuming it. You're actually playing a part. Your character's doing something that their actions evolve based on what the new content that's coming, and it's regular, so your character's always developing in some way. You're not getting that big static wait time. Like right now, World of Warcraft is about to hit its annual drought of content until the next expansion comes.
Yeah, and the big thing that VNext and Revival have in common is the concept of the episodic kind of weekly updates. And VNext is going to be more seasonal. I think they've got several weeks that they're planning to do. But that is, I think, one of the crucial things is having the world evolving week by week versus waiting a year and a half for the world to change. If we can get other games to move us forward, and Crowfall has that in its own way for people who like to have their worlds destroyed. That will happen on a cyclical basis. So there'll be some of that there too.
One of the sorry to jump in, but you just made me think of something, Diggs. One of the intriguing things to me about Revival and what they're doing systemically with their game is that other MMORPGs, they have basically all their game systems are a framework, a structure. They without one, certain parts will crumble. They're all interconnected in that way. Whereas Revival, they're trying to design their systems to be these individual spheres and balls, and they're all rolling around on the table interacting. And when it comes to story, you take something like that, the episodic way you mentioned, GMs are going to be able to change things. Whenever they want to add new mechanics, whenever they say, hey, maybe our game needs this, or we want to improve it some way, they build another ball and they roll it on the table, rather than, we have to spend a year and a half to figure out how to piece this thing in. As long as you build these, it's kind of like, Magic the Gathering or other trading card games. You have an established framework of rules, and then when you're implementing a new card set or a new individual card, you have to just make sure that it's balanced within those overarching rules, and then you have this widely infinite size. Magic the Gathering, there's thousands and thousands of cards, and you can, none of them necessarily break the game anymore. It just all depends on how they work together. So that's why they have created now different rule sets to limit things. But if you're doing it this way, it creates such an amazing potential to all of a sudden now you can let the story, what players are doing in your world, determine what you're going to add mechanically to the game and improve the actual functional experience of what players are able to do with the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
Now,
Neuro,
I
want to hear more from Neuro.
Yeah, so one of the games I keep on talking about it, I'm like the only person that's ever heard of it because I know and totally love the developers making it, Upsilon Circuit. I brought it up before. I brought it up when Paul was on. The way they're doing it is kind of interesting to me. It's like a sort of game show with an arcing storyline. I'm not sure if it's linear or if it's a diverging storyline, but basically it's going to be like 2 hours a day, I think 5 days a week, only 8 people in the world at a time, and if you die, that's it. You are no longer able to participate as a combatant. You can never play it necessarily again, but you can still communicate in the world with people that are actually still playing. So it's kind of a really interesting way to do things. Like I said, it's kind of got that game show element. The other aspect to it is, along with the the story arc being played through by the players, the game show elements to it include the narrator character, which is hilarious and probably is going to be used to tell a lot of the story and stuff. But also that there's player involvement, that the more you spend time in the audience, the more you get points to do things to help the player or send more creatures at them. So it's got more of almost an MMO-ish element in that respect. While there's only 8 people that are actually playing in the world, everybody else is essentially playing by affecting change in the world while the players are playing. Now, the thing that's also really interesting to me is they're only going to run it once, ever. Once it starts, it goes. And once it ends, they might run it again sometime if it was super popular. But the goal is just to let that be that and just let it be a part of history. So to me, that's really a massive, bold sort of thing. They've been working on it for at least a couple of years now, if not more. Two-person team.
The hard thing with happens only once content is developing such a solid system, like back-end system, that isn't going to become antiquated very quickly and is able to accept new content without major tweakings. We're used to seeing expansions and like new version, the next step of a game involving major overhauls, like graphical upgrades, like real changes that involve tons and tons of testing. The difficulty in building a game that's ready for new content without any chance of that new content breaking what's already there you got to have a really strong core game and not one that's going to be out of date quickly. And I don't know how you just got to hope that you've got lasting power, right?
I think that Epsilon Circuit game can be a whole show on its own, just discussing the potential of taking game show style mechanics and start, with the way that we can access information and people can just log in and link up, start turning game shows into, mechanics into playable games. That is really intriguing. Just on its own, that's crazy.
Well, and that's kind of the goal with VNX, was that you'd play an episode and then you talk about it and stuff with your buddies, kind of like you would with Game of Thrones or another show.
Yeah, and that's a limited in scope in a couple of ways, because you play for like an hour per week or something like that, a couple hours per week, and then that's your episode each week, and then you have a season, which is, I forget how many episodes, but it's only 10 or 20 episodes or something like that before they make the next one. One of the things that I'm hoping for, that I'm looking forward to, is, again, moving away from the astronomical vertical progression. That's kind of what requires so many countless months waiting for an expansion, is bumping everything up to such levels that it's a astronomically different experience than what you had before. And if you have a much more shallow level progression, then you can, reintroduce new stuff in the same areas versus building a whole new area that's got to be so much more difficult and challenging to move through. If you can, for revival, if you can keep repopulating Crown's Rock with new adventures, that's a lot easier than having to constantly add new continents.
It could be an argument towards something that I've said many times. I'm not for having something be more gear-based, because you can add in, it would be like, and Neuro's talked about this a little bit previously, that if you add one new piece of gear, you're changing the meta game, you're not necessarily changing the game. It's like adding a new card in Hearthstone or adding a new hero in or champion in League of Legends, whatever. I don't know what it's called, but it's just like it's adding like one more piece to the puzzle for people to work out, and it changes the way that people play more than how powerful they are. So, and you can add things that across all. If there are only 4 or 5 tiers, you can add things that are a little bit different across all tiers to create more options. So, and different styles that arise out of that, and different ways of putting your character together, just based on putting out, a couple little new things. They seem little, but especially if there's a competitive aspect of the game, or even potentially structured PvE content that requires people to play differently. But I think we're mostly interested in seeing AI progress for to have difficult combat encounters.
I kind of equate it to like an artistic palette. It's like you've had only this range of colors, and then all of a sudden you're given 3 browns, and everyone's like, "Holy crap! Our forest looked horrible before. Now they're going to look awesome."
Mm-hmm.
It's
Or the whole thing is different. I mean, even if, because I'm thinking in terms when I'm thinking of SOG, because we mentioned last time horizontal progression, and I was talking about cooking, but even just adding a new spice, one new spice can be added to all dishes of all levels vertically.
Mm-hmm.
Fish sauce.
That's a game changer, and that helps make things those low level items that you create will no longer be obsolete just because they're low level. It's something that you can always use.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the real place that showed its face first is in trading card games, or Pokemon actually took it into playable, a linear game. It took that element, because you add something new and it kind of changes the whole landscape. I think that's something we really, that was a big factor to me of why I liked EverQuest Next, was seeing them really cling to this idea of horizontal progression rather than vertical, because that's something I really enjoyed about League of Legends. All of a sudden the whole meta changes by what you're playing, by what new thing gets added. And I think that's what we saw, when they said, hey, we're going to have 40 classes and they have limited abilities. You add one new class, or you add one new ability for a handful of classes, and all of a sudden, since anybody can mix and match, with 4 abilities, all of a sudden it changes the whole landscape of how you can fight. And it's something that I think Revival is going to do. I know they're, like, specifically if you're a sword fighter, there's going to be X amount of stances. If they add one new stance, that's going to change the whole landscape of a sword duel. And they can do that with any, new system. So I think that's a key, but also, too, there's so many people, we're ingrained in the idea of having vertical progression. You're going to have that depth as well, to some extent, that somebody who takes something they like and they can just play deeply into it as well.
There's one little meta element that I'm going to kind of point at Project Gorgon that I think is really awesome, could also be used in a game that's, adding more dynamic elements, is that I think it was that you meditate at places and some of your martial arts skills would get different modifiers on them that wouldn't previously be available, and it'd only be for that day. I like that. I like it that, certain days, certain times, certain events can cause you to be more powerful or less powerful with certain things, because that completely changes the meta. One day, these things are just whooping you because you have nothing against, nothing you can use against them. The next day, it turns out they were using an ability that was actually buffed that day. Now your axe ability is buffed for that day, so they're not knocking you in the face as they were before, and likewise, you're just chopping them down with this ability that's super powerful for just a day.
And it changes where you want to go, because the buff is only available for the day, but the buff only lasts for like an hour or something like that. So you want to make sure that you're in that part of the world and working where it's more conducive to the way you like to play. And I agree that is a pretty neat element in Project Gorgon.
I know at least in Revival, at least with Magic, they intend to do that. I know there's going to be certain circumstances where, you know, a certain deity may be interested in the area and the magic will be affected, you know, during that period of time. So I'm not sure how it'll work for other systems, but I know they want to do that with Magic, adding some of that type of, you know, temporary adjustment that changes the way players can cast spells, whether they can or not, where they can, whether...
Yeah, and the deities, you can also get protection from them, PvP protection specifically. That also becomes an incentive to try and destroy the temple so that you can knock down those buffs and knock out the PvP protection. So, again, that directs you to locations where you want to hang out, but also directs you to places that you need to go if you want to get rid of those buffs for your enemies, too.
Yeah.
One second, I'm supposed to get us back on topic, but I'm just about to sneeze.
I was gonna actually attempt to do that.
Okay,
but...
you go for it. You go for it. I'll sneeze.
I was gonna say there's another incentive for indirect PvP too, non-combat PvP, which is also good.
Yeah. Well, one thing that, you know, all the things we've been talking about, different various systems, horizontal progression, all these things, in context of storytelling, I think having all these things actually opens up doors to ways people can experience the story. You know, at least at the very bottom level, there's probably a lot of ways that, you know, people could drive stories differently depending on the influence and agency they have. But, you know, you start adding this wide breadth of horizontal progression and these things that can change everything. And when you're talking about story, you know, you may get there may be some new little ability in the world, and all of a sudden that changes. Maybe it totally affects your character's story. Maybe that one thing they added affects the way your whole future life will go in that game. You know, I think that it's another interesting way that you can break up the monotony of being on this linear path and having a predictable story. You know, this takes it to more of an unpredictable, something comes in and all of a sudden the whole world's changing. Maybe the world is completely static in a sense, but the way everything works suddenly changes because of something that's been added. So that'll obviously change how things are going to move around in the world and the way the story's going to unfold in the future. You may be predicting, you know, something that would happen for a week, and something gets added, and now you have to throw that out the window. Like, now what's going to happen? Now what path do I take?
And the idea of logging into a world and having to kind of look around to figure out what's going on in the story of the world, and, you know, having a general idea of things that you want to do, building up your character in a way that your character has goals and you have your own motives and you know what you're doing, but then having to look around and be like, whoa, things are a little bit different now, and I've got to reevaluate how I'm going to go about working on my goals. And that's a play consequence of a type of storytelling. Instead of logging in and seeing, well, it says right here on my quest bar on the side of the screen that I'm supposed to go talk to Bob.
Well, and not just that, but you add to the fact that, you know, when you start having people, you have mechanics that are actually causing people, they have to start looking around, you know, they're not being hand-guided. All of a sudden, you're creating more immersion for every player, you know, and it's not something necessarily that's like, oh, I have to spend the extra time reading this. It's just a built-in immersion, so now whatever story you do have, you're making even more impactful because now people are actually paying attention to it. So whatever story you do have, whatever the GMs are doing, the bigger arc, whatever the person next to you is doing in their world, all of a sudden you have this, you know, you have more reason for it to matter to your story. You know, you have more reason for it to impact what you're doing. So I've always been like a major fan of creating in-game functions, meaningful functions that, increase the level of immersion, because I think it enhances the game for everybody, not just, whoever that specific thing is affecting.
Well, there's one real easy one that can be done, and that's blocking pathways, and that can have a lot of different implications. There's a common quest, people have to go from point A to point B. Well, there's bandits taking over that road, so you either have to, swing wide and go through a really dangerous part of the forest to get to the other side, or you have to get some help clearing the bandits, or you have to take down a bandit, find parts that they use for their disguise, maybe eavesdrop on another group and kind of learn some of their code words and customs, and kind of sneak your way through the camp. But that sort of thing could also be like almost an artificial level gating sort of thing. It's like, we're going to make more difficult content on the other side of this cave-in, so we're going to do a cave-in and put some tough creatures in front of it, and once you've cleared them out and removed those boulders, the area is now more difficult than it used to be. And we've just increased the scale of difficulty for that, because that's something that honestly could be designed to be done on the fly, both creating those sorts of events and the ability to seal an area, kind of redo the attributes of it, and have that based on a storytelling event.
Yeah, and not in the way of, in EQ1, once a month there were giant skeletons in East Commons, or I think that's where they were. But the giant skeleton invasions. But this scheduled event cycle. And World of Warcraft does their holiday things. Well, we need to have a whole thing talking about how much I hate holidays on one of my return episodes in the future. But
I'm right there with you.
I hate them too, unless they're tied specific to the lore.
I like in-game holidays, but not Halloween and Christmas in my fantasy world. But it should be, there's something that's really happening, and it's happening now. Not, well, it's that. There can be the full moon event, that there's something that only happens and happens periodically and is only possible during the full moon. But the preference is that when the world is changing, the world is changing. Now, if there's a periodic event that something only happens on the full moon, and everybody is all hyped up for it, and everyone's getting ready, and then it doesn't happen. Now that's a cool event. The lack of event becomes a cool event because and then everybody who's playing the game thinks, the forums outcry, the game was broken, our event didn't happen, rah, 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 rah. But,
actually, I'm going to go with the biblical Old Testament example with this one. Moses strikes the rock one time, water's supposed to spout out, doesn't happen, strikes the rock again, and water spouts out. And that's the reason why he was punished and couldn't reach the promised land. So that same sort of thing. You all did the event, it just takes 48 hours for that creature to actually, spawn there. So you did the thing, and then you all scatter, and then 2 days later, this giant freaking dragon busts out of the mountain and just starts tearing up the town. It's like, where the hell did this come from? You're not ready for it because you all scattered. It's been 2 days.
Revival has an interesting concept where their constellations represent the gods. If you're expecting a great old one constellation to appear, but it's not there, probably means it's showing up somewhere in the world. So that can be an interesting way to add things to the story that way too. Revival also, you guys need to take a look at today's blog. They talk about the different kinds of quests that they have. Opportunities and rumors is kind of that the middle of their three, which is similar to what Sog was talking about. You want to be listening to what the NPCs are talking about around you. You want to be keeping up with the newspaper and seeing what the news events are, and that'll give you some paths to adventure.
I think an interesting thing about everything we've talked about so far today, you know, from the very beginning of the show till now, if I feel like the common denominator in what we want from story has been some level of unpredictability or constant change. And to me personally, I feel like the reason that this happens, or like the reason that, you know, this is kind of what everybody's kind of looking for, is because, you know, with the age of information and having access to the internet, and we can look up anything that's going to happen, you know, anything, we can look up all the guides. Just MMOs, we're so much in control. We just have the game under our fingers, you know, and we know what's going to happen. Everything's so predictable. I think what everybody wants is a break from this. Like, everybody wants to suddenly experience something that they can't predict. You know, that's something that was a big joy that we had in early MMOs, because nobody had ever done that before. We didn't know what to expect. That was the original joy. And I think, you know, story is obviously what a lot of people look to provide that. You know, that's what you want to happen in your newest expansion in the MMO you play. You know, you want the story to come along and change something, to make something you didn't expect, to, you know, create some new adventure, some new mystery for yourself. And it just, the sad thing is, it doesn't happen in today's model, because we have access to information. There's doing interviews, you know, and I can blame, you know, myself, my own job, my own site. Like, we go and interview these developers. Hey, this is going to contain this, and everybody knows. Whereas if you actually take the time to develop a dynamic world, you can have that problem.
Data miners have also always been a big problem. That's it wasn't initially a problem. I don't know that there were data miners in the early days of EQ. I don't know that there were data miners in the early days of UO. But by the time WoW hit, oh yes, data miners aplenty. One of my buddies would find like 2-3 unique items a day, and he didn't tell us, but it turns out, I'm pretty sure later on, that yeah, he was data mining. He would find exactly which creature in the world at that moment had a purple item, what their XYZ was, walk over to them, kill them, grab their loot, and it spoiled everything for everyone else. I would only find one random purple in the world maybe once or twice a month. So data mining was definitely a problem. But then the other half of it is actually the story. All the items, all of their flavor text, and, you know, what's revealed from that, every line of text that an NPC says, if all of that stuff can be accessed, people will read it, people will look it up, and then they'll tell everyone else and spoil it. So that's one of the things, and I don't know if like streamed content is the solution, where we only get so much of the art and assets on our side, and everything else we download from the server at the time that we need it, or, you know, what the solution is for something like that. But it's definitely something that's further impacted our kind of inability to enjoy the content of the game by playing the game.
Yeah, download the expansion, run it through your data mining utilities that you've already built up, break down the game to not being a game anymore and just doing a task, and then tell everybody to do that too. Yeah, that's the life we live right now.
It's interesting because you see developers trying to create ways to keep people focused on the in-game stuff, you know, to keep people from going through all that. They spend so much time doing that, and on the flip side, you see like the MOBA genre, they're doing the opposite thing. Like, they've actually built their game to have people focused a lot on all what's happening outside the game, paying attention to builds, doing all this stuff so that they're, you know, but with MMOs it's different. When you're trying to convey a story, you know, or let people have an adventure, a mystery, a hero's journey, then all of a sudden you don't want people paying attention to everything that's happening outside the game, you know, unless it's supporting lore, like the EverQuest Next books. I loved that concept, and I hope that game still achieves what it wants to achieve, because that's just a really cool way of doing things. But anyways, I'm diverging off topic again.
I don't necessarily mind. I don't think of it so much as being predictable. I mean, spoilers don't bother me, but static content does bother me. Mm-hmm. And so the problem for me is getting through the story and then getting stuck with dailies and everything repeating itself. And so that's why I'm excited about the AI, where the AI can be making decisions on the fly. That's going to lead to the unpredictability. Because I want to know if I saved the farm from burning down. I want to know 2 weeks later what happened to their lives. How did their lives change after I saved them? I brought the widow's son back to her because he was lost, and does he get married later? What happens 3 months later to their lives? That's the kind of stuff that I'm interested in, and you can't get that when either you go back and the guy is just still standing in the same spot, or he's disappeared again and the widow is still standing outside the door
and
waiting for
that's an
somebody else to
unfortunate
return.
thing, because it's basically that event has to reset for the next person to walk up and get their part of the hero's quest done. And that's definitely one of the things that I was really excited for EQ, and I still am excited for EQ, and if it does come through, to have that sort of stuff, and have that, going back to what I was saying a little bit earlier on, that kind of micro-scale granularity of cause and effect, and what that actually means for the world. Now, one thing that absolutely has to go away, has to go away, absolutely cannot exist, is you log into the game, you open a menu, you browse for daily quests, and then do them, and then log off. That's gotta not happen. If there's daily quests people are doing, it has to be, you go to a vendor and they say, hey, I need more such and such, or the guards say, hey, we've seen some bandits up this road. Could you do a patrol? Get a little note from the guards at the other town and come back, and we'll pay you a commission. That sort of stuff. That's great. It's definitely a chore, but once again, in the context of a cause and effect sort of world, it's a chore that has a meaning, that the materials have to come from somewhere. They're going to be used to make something, and likewise, you doing that commission to patrol the road, maybe you were the only one to get that, or they only need 3 people for that, and if somebody doesn't come back, maybe after a couple of days, if the person never comes back through the gates, somebody else will get a different mission. Hey, find this person, find information about them, or check and see if there's any corpses on the side of the road or anything. So that sort of stuff. Getting rid of traditional go in a menu dailies, but being able to add things that do need to be done every day, whether by players or by NPCs.
I think that all circles us back around to the original kind of starting topic that Sog mentioned. Storytelling vehicles. All of this storytelling all gets limited by what systemic vehicles that you have to do it. And right now, they have quest givers, quest hubs. This is the thing. So when you want to give somebody something daily to do, if they've accomplished all the linear stuff, you have to do it this way. Whereas in an EverQuest Next or in a Revival, you have a different type of system where now NPCs have changing needs. So if you no longer even have to have a daily quest thing, because anybody can go to any NPC and they should have something new or some new need or something. Maybe you might even run into the situation where there's a farmer who is always short of one thing, and he's got that same repetitive thing. So the guy who likes to do the same stuff over and over again, even he's got something that he wants to do. So I think it's really interesting, because one thing that always fascinates me about games, MMORPGs, or any type of interactive storytelling experiences, it's this unique combination of art, narrative, and mechanics. Because the mechanics facilitate the interaction and how we can experience the story, and it's not something you get in any other format, not in movies, not in books, nothing. There's no other thing like it, and I think it's a pretty amazing thing. And I'm excited to see these future games. We've mentioned several just in this show that are kind of taking new steps in transforming the way narrative is delivered, and just that alone transforms the way that we're going to be able to interact with that narrative. So I think it's going to be a pretty incredible time in the near future. I say near future, hopefully near future. It all depends on how quickly and how supportive people are of these different projects. So that's really...
They should start coming through and actually being playable, close to completion or completion in 2017. That's going to be the year of the, evolving, immersive, persisting MMO. Till then, I think we're going to see a lot of things in the works, making a lot of progress, not quite being ready to launch. There might be a couple of smaller titles from some of the smaller studios, and they might work really well. One of them was a Worlds Adrift, the one that's the floating voxel islands one. I don't think it's going to need to take till 2017. At the same time, that's very much like a more UO, EVE Online sort of player drives the story. The players drive the storyline, and the players are the story sort of interaction, and less of a, guided narrative sort of thing.
The big fix I think everybody's going through right now while we're waiting for this, original MMO type experience we had of an unpredictable world, I think everybody's in this survival game fix or sandbox fix. Like, everybody's kind of playing some form of survival or sandbox game because it gives them some of that unpredictability. You don't know what you're going to expect, what other people have built, what, I don't know. Maybe I'm totally biased. I think that, everybody's kind of craving this type of unpredictability or this new experience that, and there's survival games offer that in a different flavor, but yeah, I think that's what we're seeing so much of.
We're getting close to wrapping up time and having no questions, but I want to try to boil down like the progression of the MMO, the MMORPG that we've been talking about. That, like Dig said, EverQuest had no story initially. EverQuest was a world where there were things to do, and there were some regular recycling events, and there was a history to the world. There were things that you could learn about the world, but there was no ongoing story to the world. And then we got this new generation of, well, players like having something to guide them, so we're going to give every player, their own one variation on their own story that shows them progressing through the game. And we're getting to the point where it's hard to do that better than some games are doing it now. I believe. If people haven't played Final Fantasy XIV, I recommend at least checking it out if that's something that you want to experience. If that's not something you're into, don't. But the individual story and the way that you feel progressing through it is very, very good. But
is that the one where you said it has an equivalent of a Rose song, or was that 15?
No, that's the same game that Phantom X said, that it has that kind of thing that tells you kind of where there's more action in the world at that time. But yeah, the best part of the game is, they're Final Fantasy makers. The individual storyline and progression, including the group content, is very good. But I think that the next step that we're all looking for is we want to go back to playing EverQuest. We want that kind of open world with things to do, and we've used the term sandbox has become something that we use to describe that, but it's not 100% accurate. But take that sandbox and allow the sandbox to have its story. And that is the next stage. And you guys always talk about Revival, and the one thing that they've coined very, very well is the multiplayer evolving online world, which is in essence exactly what I'm suggesting is where these kinds of games need to go. That we need to we've done the massive multiplayer online single player experience and it's been done very, very well, and there's so much out there that I couldn't play it all in the next 10 years, and I could have fun doing all of that. But where I want my home to be is, and maybe Revival isn't the game for me because it's not the world that I necessarily want to be playing in, But what I do want is that idea of a meow is the term, the multiplayer evolving online world. And when we talk about storytelling vehicles, I want the world itself to be describing the story back to me, instead of I'm following along a path and reading text. I want to be in my normal interaction when I play the game, noticing changes and interacting with other people to it. Did you guys see that you can't buy fish from Phil the fisherman? You know, yeah, he doesn't have any. He's out of fish. You guys see that? And they're like,
I don't deal with fish. I only make beef jerky.
yeah,
But
it creates all kinds of new kinds of experiences based on that.
And yeah, because I normally don't go fishing in these games, but if I knew that if I did go fishing, that could have an impact and he could have fish again, I might choose to do that. That would give more meaning to that activity.
I think
that I normally would participate in.
I think too, like the main thing that in the current model of games we have, when a new expansion comes out and there's more story, you know, what it's doing is creating change in the world. So as long as you have, it's basically something that is unique, changing forms, disappearing, you know, becoming, losing influence, something like that. So, you know, in a multiplayer evolving online world, the whole idea is to take that to the micro level, and each NPC is unique. They have a permanence. You know, they could die and they don't exist anymore, and you know that creates story right at that level, because all of a sudden you have something that it's finite. You know, it doesn't have, and it won't be there forever. So all of a sudden it has meaning, because if it's not there forever, this is the only chance you get with it. So.
Well, and the crazier aspect, as I keep brainstorming over what Sog just said, is what happens if we go fishing and nobody's getting fish? That's an even greater mystery.
And it takes the whole community to figure that out. And then, why?
Right.
And then the why, and understanding that, changes the way that we interact with the whole world. And the writing team sees how we're interacting with the world and starts to plan on how what we've done as a community changes the future, because last week something else changed, or 3 weeks ago something else changed, and we're going to experience the effects of how we dealt with the change 3 weeks ago now. And so they don't need to do that like the next week. It doesn't have to be one thing. These little changes that happen, but eventually all converge back to, you know, main events that they plan.
Right. And one of the things that we've been talking about is storytelling in terms of how we progress through the story of the world. But another aspect is with these static quests, the static content, that's another reason why we don't have to interact with other players in the game. We don't have to I don't have to ask you, hey, what did you do in Mulgore? I know what you did in Mulgore because I did the same thing, and I know you did the exact same thing too. So I don't have to have a conversation with you because we've already done the same stuff. If the world is changing and we haven't had the same experiences, if I've been gone for a week, I can start asking questions like, what the hell happened to the fish? And you guys can tell me. You know, the players can also be the storytellers because they've had different experiences, and all of those different experiences.
The story is changing, but the players are the ones actively telling it. So then the way the story gets retold in the future isn't quoting the text from the quest line. It's anecdotal. This was my experience, and this is how I lived through it, and this is how I pieced the information together, and in the end, even though the devs may be thinking, yeah, you guys never really got it at all, and we hear 10 years later, what, you guys never got the point, and there's all this historical writing about the reasons why something happened and how everything went on, and you look at it, we could completely miss the mark, and it wouldn't be a bad thing. It would be an interesting thing about the world itself.
I think that's the point where we move to, you know, I mentioned earlier that you have the developer crafted story and it gets told to you and you consume it. Or you have the choose your own adventure in a developer crafted environment. And then the last one you have, that's where we're getting to. Like once you create a world that facilitates this, now you have a player told story. You know, the players are telling the story and all they're telling is what's happening in the world, creating reasons for it. You know, and you have a reason to talk to people, and you know the whole social life of the game comes back. You know, it all of a sudden has more meaning to it. You know, the interaction between players, which is, you know, not something everybody likes, but I don't think that for most people having this social environment awaken in MMORPGs is gonna be something most people don't like. I don't think.
So we're past 10 o'clock. I do have one small announcement. Today is my last official, like, as many weeks as I possibly can member of the show because I start school next week. It doesn't mean I won't be around. I'm still going to be in the chat, and as people are needed and when I can, I'll be here. But I have to, I'll be stepping down my level of interaction with the show. I will do my best to be available in chat, and I'm never far away from my computer or my phone, so I'm easily reachable. But I've had a blast over the last almost a year now, and I will be back for our 1-year episode for sure. You guys can count me in for that.
Yeah, I didn't have. I guess the only thing I had that I wanted to say is 10 Ton Hammer is actually revitalizing its forums and bringing them back. So I love forums, and I will definitely be in there talking about anything. So if you guys want a new home, I know the Daybreak forums have gotten not as friendly. So if you want a new little home to go discuss everything in with, you know, the community, I feel like the TheoryForge community is, you know, in a large part originating from the communities of EverQuest Next, Landmark, and Revival. So come chat with me about games in there. I miss you guys. Twitter's not my environment. You don't too few characters to talk about the things I like to talk about. So, but yeah, that's the only thing I have. And other than that, Diggs, Neuro, do you guys have anything to add?
Nope.
See you next week, I guess.
Do you guys have a topic for next week? Any idea?
I have no idea, but I do know I won't be here next week because I have a family invasion happening of all my in-laws, so I won't be here. I'll probably be in the chat, maybe if I can. I'll pop in from my Surface Pro. So.
All right. Well, I think that's it for us, and thank you again, everyone, for coming. We appreciate it always, and I will talk to everybody soon.
See you later.